Hello and welcome to another episode of Getting Started.Life on the WGSN-DB Going Solo Network. Our show is about getting started with new things. It's about the 5 steps to get started in the biggest mistake. And interesting show today. I'm going to turn it over to Marya and we'll jump right in.
Our guest today is our very own getting started on, what did he say last week? Getting started on a new hobby. If he had to go through a divorce, that would be the first thing he would do. So
Absolutely.
Lots of experience getting started, but also timely because one of Doug's many areas of expertise is, why don't you tell us, Doug?
Yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about disaster preparedness and getting started for being ready for maybe not the inevitable, but the unfortunate.
And I think we all have a newfound perspective on what can happen over the last year and a half, 2 years, right, with COVID. But it's not just COVID that could happen. It's any type of natural disaster, any type of medical disaster. You know, if someone in your house gets really sick and you need to shore up a bit. So I think that people are more interested in this maybe than they have been in the past, but definitely don't know where to start.
No, totally. And I think, frankly, people need that road to Damascus moment a lot of times. And for some, it was COVID, but there's people who consider that a passing thing. I think other people find, something in social media or popular media that maybe makes them think a little bit differently about preparedness. And I think it's actually a good thing.
Well, and I mean, it could be, remember, was it 2 years ago that Texas had the big ice storm?
Yep.
Nobody saw that coming, right? And there's, parts of the country.
Arguably, people did see it coming, but right.
Most people living their day-to-day lives weren't anticipating it. There's areas of the countries that are repeatedly hit with, flooding or hurricanes or stuff like that. So,
and I do talk about that as one of the steps, and frankly, also, I think when people's priorities change, there's, as you get older and have other responsibilities, preparedness becomes something less just about you than everyone else. And for me, it was, I read the book, The Road, and it was such a raw book about parenting in that type of environment that for me, that I said, it's parental malpractice. And I would be a terrible father if I was responsible for my family not being prepared.
I do not know that book. I'm afraid to read it, I think.
It's a good movie. They did a movie version that was actually pretty good. And oddly enough, I find it uplifting. Most people don't, but I think it really gets at a raw component of, the character in it. It's a father and a son. No spoilers there because it's been out for a while. But he's so devoted to the son, as shown through surviving through a very, very difficult apocalyptic landscape, but the skills and the things he knows allowed him to do that. And I looked at it and said, that's where I've got to be.
We binge watched during quarantine last year. We binge watched a show called Alone, where they put a bunch of people out in the wilderness and they have to survive literally alone, not with a bunch of camera crew. They have and it was interesting to see the people that had not only the skill, but the mental fortitude to handle something like that. So
I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think the mental capability to go through something like that, excuse me, is sometimes predicated upon building that into your mind as a possibility in the future. So I think when people are surprised by it, there's a panic, where if there's a recognition mentally and emotionally that it can occur, and what do I need to do to be ready for it? Because people used to make fun of me and say, oh, you're worried about this. I say, I'm actually not worried. You should be. I'm not worried, because I've built into my mind, yes, something bad can happen. Here's what I need to do to be ready. And if the unlikely and unfortunate time that it happens, I'm working through the plan that I made, as opposed to going, what do I do now? So
my general decision-making process is, what's the worst that can happen, and can I handle that? Yep. And that's how I make a lot of my decisions. And I think that's how a lot of people handle anxiety too, is kind of looking at, if this happens, how do I handle it, and walking through those steps. So,
and frankly, I think that before I go into the steps, I think that the methodology in thinking through it actually, because people think disaster preparedness and they only think like, comet hits the earth and whatever, right? Something like that. But you could have financial disaster. You could have all kinds. And once you take a certain lens looking at life and everything that you do, then ultimately you'll come up with disaster plans for every part of your life, right? And the one we're talking about today is life and limb, but all these other things, you should have contingencies in place. You should be thinking from the perspective of what if something bad happens tomorrow? And then you're able to rest and relax and sleep at night.
A couple years ago when I got my breast cancer diagnosis, I had just put in place 6 months prior a life insurance policy. Because I'd always had them through employers, but then I went self-employed. And I was like, oh, I should put this in place. And I got to tell you, having that in place when I got the diagnosis took one big piece of worry off the plate.
Yep.
And worth its weight in gold.
No, totally. And that's what I think all of this gets down to. And I don't believe it's a doom and gloom thing. And I do think the challenge with some of this, and hopefully the steps, and the reason my company, when I had it, was called the Mellow Prepper, is I think that there's a stigma, right? Back, if you look in the 50s, self-reliance and all that, and I'm just picking the 50s because, you picture the Boy Scout and self-reliance and field craft and families knowing how to can and how to build a fire. That stuff was it was looked at positively. There wasn't a lunatic fringe that was driving it and intermingling the skill set with political aim or nefarious plans. And as time went on, even automation and things like that, all of a sudden these became less and less required skills. But on top of that, you have popular media and popular culture painting the apocalyptic, that whole thing in a certain way. Yep. So now, I mean, even if you go back, there was a movie in the, I think 80s. It was Robin Williams and Walter Matthau. It was a movie called, at that point, they were called Survivors and not Preppers, or Survivalists. So the painting of it from a lunatic fringe perspective, you could look and say, let's say you go back to the 80s, say 1980, right? You're talking, 40 years. So that's a long time for people to stigmatize a certain group. And people who have a certain, focus on something like this, because it did get stigmatized as it got intermingled with a lot of other stuff. And now those skills, there's almost, when you bring the stuff up to people, they're like, oh, no, I didn't think I should ever have to build fire or know how to purify water and not die and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. My husband likes to say, just because you're crazy doesn't mean you're wrong.
Absolutely. Well, and I'll be honest, when the lockdown happened, I had neighbors who would tease me, and at least one of them said, you were 100% right. Like, I wasn't worried about the grocery store. I wasn't worried about, things like power going off, which didn't happen, thank God, but what would have happened in that case?
Yep.
So, and actually, the first step kind of plays into a little bit what we're talking about, because unless you understand risk, there's no call to action. There's no inspiration to be prepared for anything. So as long as you're going on your merry way in the very thin veneer of society and everything, automation and all that, you don't think about it. But one of the things we did when I had my company was we looked at where people lived. If we were doing an analysis for some, where do you live? Do you live near a fault line? Do you live where there's a lot of natural disasters? All those kind of things play into your risk, but also, other risks that are inherent, in urban versus suburban versus rural settings, and all those kind of things really help assess the risk, right? And you could look minimally, like what are the realistic things that could happen? A blizzard, a tornado, all these different natural disasters, or do you look and say, wow, all those matter, but so does a pandemic, right? Like, I was a big pandemic guy. Like, when you get people on forums and things like that, there's like earthquake guys and pandemic guys, whatever. I'm kind of a pandemic guy because for me, if you look about every certain cycle, there's a pandemic, and you got guys like Bill Gates and a lot of other people who were who that's what a lot of their foundations gave to, and they were screaming the alarm. It is coming. It is coming. So I looked and said, it's probably single digit percentage, maybe less. But in my lifetime, if I wasn't through the last one, which would have been the flu of 1918, then there's probably a chance I'm going to live through one now. And I haven't yet, so I should do some planning. So I think risk is kind of understanding the threat, right? I take a very military view on how to do this, military planning. What is the threat? What are the risks? And what's the realistic possibility that on any day, based on those percentages, something could go wrong? And it's not like, it's not that false thing where, hey, the percentages increase over time. They don't, right? Every day you wake up, something can happen. They probably increase with when it is in the year and some other stuff. But generally, you're going to wake up and there's a percentage that the world could not be as you expected, either on a micro or macro scale.
Are we focusing mostly on like natural disaster, pandemic? Because I think we all saw the pandemic came with a lot more risk other than just getting sick, right?
Yeah. Yes. I think where I was more life and limb. My other stuff, I look at that way. But there's an argument that says if you put away food and you have an income crisis, and can't go to the store and spend what you used to, if you put food away, you're not saving it for a different disaster. That's a legitimate disaster. But for me, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a natural disaster. One of the things, and I'm a pretty grim guy, I guess, thinking about this, but what I look at is, well, if you look at cascading effects, and you saw it with COVID, so risk has to be viewed in the cumulative in some ways. So it doesn't take much to take out our power grid. So if something happens, a small thing can take out the power grid, which then causes like man-made craziness. So my whole thing always, there was a point where, there is the natural disaster. There's enemies too, right? There's a great book about that I read 1 second later that was about an EMP. I'm reading a book right now about if we were to go to war with China. There's a lot of circumstances under which all of a sudden we wake up tomorrow and none of our technology works and people start turning on each other, which will happen. Or someone releases some kind of biological, nuclear, or biomedical thing to kill. Like there's a lot of things. And when you start looking at it, again, it's not about being afraid. It's looking and saying, can I go to sleep at night not being prepared for all these possible things? And when you I would put people through a survey, and they would inevitably come back, the results would come back and say, you're actually pretty worried. And they're like, no, I'm not. I'm like, well, your answers say different. So I think there's also something in our psyche that says, tune it out. It won't happen it's kind of like the Titanic was dry. You could stand on the deck until you couldn't.
Yep.
And that's where I think knowing the risk and accepting it is a huge part. And that's if you don't do that, you're never going to be committed.
I think maybe some reasons that people shy away from this, though, is because it feels overwhelming, right? There are so many potential disasters.
And that's actually step 2, right?
Okay.
So for me, and before I get into step 2, for me, it was about what stuff is transferable, right? Like if I'm thinking pandemic, well, maybe I'll stock masks and gloves and that kind of stuff. But everything else still applies if all the lights go out, right? So realistically, I think if you're starting out, knowing your objectives is huge. So, and what's interesting is when I tell people about knowing their objectives, I was riding the L one day, right, and just bored. I think my battery died on my phone. I'm looking, and there was a sign from Cook County or City of Chicago or something, and the sign said you should be ready for 2 weeks. And I had a good friend who worked for Department of Homeland Security, and he said, double whatever they tell you. And it wasn't he was in talking, but that's where I look and say most people also underestimate how long they need to be ready and how quickly someone will come to help. So that's where I would also, as part of the survey I had, and people could do a self-survey, say, okay, what's a realistic amount of time? What have I seen? Like with Katrina, how long did it take for them to get stuff under control? Like you can look historically and say, geez, 30 days might be too short. Maybe I'll hit 60. So knowing your objectives and knowing how ready you want to be, is a big part of it. And that takes a little work, right? That takes either taking classes, and you can, and there's stuff out there, reading, or going to the internet. And as I said, the internet for this stuff can be a scary place.
Yeah.
And I think that's people would get turned off really quickly if they saw like some of the stuff you're seeing now. I saw 10 years ago in some of these forums that I wasn't active in. I was looking for information about canning or what can you take can you take animal antibiotics? And so, incidentally, they're the same thing. Believe it or not, don't take them because I'm saying this. Do your own research, but they are actually the same thing. So, but you end up in these forums, and there's like crazy people. So it really makes sense to help find your objectives and know what you want to do. You've got to pick the right sources, and I would say find somebody who you're comfortable talking to, like me. And hey, you know what? Like, how long should I be ready? How do I do this? And then you don't have to do this alone. You all probably have a crazy friend like me who knows this stuff.
So step 2, find a crazy friend.
Well, yeah, everybody needs a crazy friend for other reasons. But I think, again, knowing why you're doing it, right? Like, again, if you don't have the why you're doing it, and and I think that's both the understanding the risks and then having objectives. I don't think you're committed. And I think one thing, one reason our show is cool is it's getting you to the point to decide whether you're committed or not, right? If you could do 5 steps and do it for long enough, maybe it's a hobby or a behavior or something that would be good for you. But I think with this, there's the people out there that will go, and I still have a good mistake, but it's kind of touches on it. We'll go, oh, Costco's selling disaster kits. I'm going to go buy one. And I think they're half-assing 1 and 2, and they're not going through the rest, so they probably don't know where it is, and they're really not committed to it. They're just like, oh, it's a good idea. Someone told me I should have it. But they don't go through the steps of saying, why should I have it? Who am I doing it for? And I think the objective also comes down to like what I did, right? Like are you like, hey, I want to save my own neck, right? Yep. Or do you look and say, like I have 3 kids, now 2 that live in the house. And I'm looking at it saying they're looking to me when something goes wrong. So part of my objective is to not be a schmuck and to be, it might not work out, but at least I've got a plan and I'm in a good position to provide that. So if my objective is to take care of my family, I'm doing that. But I think the same way when you talk about life insurance, and it's the same struggle for people to overcome. Yep. It's figuring out, getting past that icky thought of, oh, bad things happen, and saying, okay, they do. And I accept it. And from that, I'm going to move forward.
Absolutely. So we know our risks. Let's just say we're in the Midwest. We've kind of identified our risks.
Yep.
We know we want to protect our family, which is probably a good portion of most people's why, right? Yeah. What's step number 3?
Plan, right? And I'm not going to get through all the plan before we go to the commercial, but the plan, I think you need to prioritize. You need to have a timeline. You need to cover all your bases, right? So priorities, like what is most important? You won't be able to do everything. What is most important? Prioritize them. I looked at it, there were really 5 things, right? There's food, there's shelter, there's medical, there's security, there's communication. I broke that down. That was my model. And I think they're all important, but probably eating and food, by food, I mean food and water, sustenance. That might be the most important, right? Like what can't you live without? Start with that. What's already covered, right? Do you live in a house? Well, if you live in a house, in some ways, shelter's covered. So there are certain things, but if you're like an earthquake person and you look at what Chicago's architecture is, they're saying if the new Madrid fault line ever kicks in again, Chicago will be flattened just because of the types of properties. Well, is that a risk? Do you need something where if there's an earthquake, you have to be able to have shelter for yourself, not depending on somebody? So I think taking those 5 things and prioritizing it, looking and saying, I will not be able to do this tomorrow. Now, some people can. Some people could write a check tomorrow and have everything they need and be prepared in 30 days. And there's been a lot written right now about millionaires, billionaires, buying like escape estates like in other countries and all this kind of stuff. A lot of those guys are spending a lot of money real quick to get to where they need to be because now they're starting to look and say, oh, things could go bad.
Sure.
But having a timeline is essential, right? And looking and saying, if I want to be ready for 90 days, let's start with 30. Move to 90 move to 30, 60, 90. And by having a plan, I think it doesn't become an event. What's interesting is if you look where kind of the term survivalist, I like the term prepper actually, because prepper is a verb. Preparing is a verb. If you're a prepper, it's kind of it's an action noun. And I believe that this is a process. So your plan should be indefinite, because even when, let's say you get to the 120 days, why not go a little bit further? But also, why, make sure you're going back and rotating some of the other stuff that you have. Like, it's a plan that is initially sort of probably uphill, and then it becomes circular, and it becomes easier to do because it's more of a lifestyle. And I think that harkens back to what I was talking about before, where, at a certain time in our history, people just knew how to do this stuff. Now it's, you have to continue to do it. Or as part of your plan, maybe it's picking up a skill every year. Maybe it is.
We're also really reliant on technology in society, right? Like, for example, we're on a well. If we lose power, there goes water, right? Like,
well, but you can, there's things you could do, but we got to go to commercial first. I'm cutting myself off for a commercial.
Yay!
But we're going to go to commercial, and we'll be right back.
All right. And we are back.
We are back with, pardon me, getting started.life on the WGSN Going Solo Network. And our guest today is me.
Our guest is you, because you are the former owner of Mellow Prepper. We're talking about things that you can do to prepare yourself for potential disasters, right? Whatever those look like, whether it's I didn't know about the earthquake fault line, so now I know, but whether it's an earthquake or whether it's a pandemic or, it could be anything.
Absolutely. And, we were talking before the commercial about making a plan. And one thing I really want to stress with that is there are certain things that should be part of your ongoing plan, right? So I talked about security. And another reason why people tend to not get prepared is the preconceived notion. I got to buy a gun, right? That's the first thing people think about, because they equate preparedness with the crazy people that they see with the guns and the flak vests who, for some reason, didn't serve their country many times, but decided to do all that stuff. But I digress. But that's not necessarily the case, right? You could take physical, self-defense to protect yourself. Where if you're a woman, you should have anyhow, because part of your preparedness is bad things that can happen all the time. It gets worse if things get worse. So that kind of thing is exceptionally important.
Or a security system for your home.
Yep. But if you, let's say, choose to do a firearm, or you choose certain things, you need, they're perishable skills. Safety is paramount.
True.
Having a gun and not going to the range. We had a show about that. You will put yourself at risk. So you've got to go out and train with it. If you're doing more hand to hand or something to defend yourself, you need a refresher or take it up as a hobby, because your muscle memory won't be there. Your body will change. Everything will change. There may be new things that you could learn from a first aid perspective. You may have one communication plan early on that's, I'm not going to depend on my cell phone. So buying a radio, like just a Motorola radio you see or whatever, some of these little ones you can buy even for kids, right? Little walkie-talkies. And then you might say, hey, you know what? I want to go a step further and become a ham radio operator and be able to communicate beyond my area and help my community. I've seen people go that way. So I think that's why the plan needs to not be finite.
Well, I like that too, because then it becomes a multi-step plan, right? Like if I want to just get the basics done just to kind of get started, I get the cheap radio from Radio Shack. And then in a year or two, as I have more, funds to maybe continue to grow my plan, then maybe I get the more expensive radio, or maybe I get a generator. Like we can put it in like phases.
Right. And you can take what was your primary, that becomes your secondary.
Yep.
Right. And all of this stuff, I do like when the power goes out, because people realize all of a sudden it's going to be different like that.
Yep.
So it is really important. And I think what people find, I found sometimes it was cool to do with my kids, right? It was something important to me. They picked up on it. I know my daughter's like that, right? She went into the military like me, and she was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely your kid, when she was going through some of the survival stuff and things like that. And I think like I found some provisions, like some stuff, long-term food that I had that my daughter and I had put together when she was like younger than my youngest right now. So it's really neat to see that and look back. But I think having that plan and sticking to it, and it could be, again, it's not to put pressure on, but maybe on a weekend you say, I'm going to take an hour and devote it to this. And then the next step, actually step 4, is budget. And you talked about that. That's the other thing that people always say, I can't because it costs too much money.
They say that about life insurance too. It
is. But the nice thing about prepping versus life insurance are there are free or almost free ways to get prepared.
Okay.
You can find, I guarantee, you can go buy food. You can do what I did and take a 5-gallon bucket from Home Depot. You put a Mylar bag in there and you fill it with rice. You put a desiccant in there. You suck out the air and use a hair straightener to seal it. And you put the top on, you seal it. As long as that doesn't get, adulterated in some way, it will be good for decades. That costs me what? 5-gallon buckets, $5 for rice. You're talking, and you're probably talking 40 pounds of rice. Like you're talking, you can very easily and inexpensively get basic food.
Yep.
Stuff like buying one extra canned good when you go to the store is what I hear some people talk about doing. It's $1. All of a sudden you have a pretty decent larder. But you can also do things like can, right? You can get other stuff on food preservation so that you're actually not wasting food you bought. Yeah. That becomes your survival food. You already bought it. So you already own that food.
Yep.
Doing things like having a garden. Yes, it costs money to do it to lay it out, but if you're eating the food, you're probably break even. But now, if something happens and it's during that time, you may have food. But you've also picked up a skill.
Also having a seed library so that if you need to have a garden, you need to have the seeds to plant.
Absolutely. Doing things like learning to, brew or distill or all those. There's a lot of things you can do for free. Like if you drink beer and you learn how to brew, that could be a skill you need later. You never know.
I'm thinking that if we have an apocalypse, if you got the skill to make alcohol, you're going to have a very valuable skill to trade that too.
But I think when it comes to, let's say, buying a firearm, you see what the sticker prices retail. You can usually find things in the secondary market inexpensively. Now with things like Facebook Marketplace, you can find people giving stuff away because it has no value to them, but now it might have value to you. And I lucked out when I bought this house. I load my own ammunition, and I picked up that skill. And some of the decisions I've made and what firearms I have are based upon doing that. But the gentleman who owned the house, this was his gunsmithing room. That's not like my prepping and whatever room, my all-purpose room. But he wasn't using his shotgun loading stuff anymore, so he gave it to me. It didn't have any value to him. To me, that would have been $1,500, $2,000, or whatever. So if you have the compunction to do it, you can find things that are free or nearly free. Picking up a skill, there are free classes for all kinds of stuff that you can do. There are sometimes ways to be involved. Like there's community programs where they want people who are prepared in the community and they're paying for the classes. There's all sorts of ways to do it. So I never think of budget as a limitation. It needs to fall in line with your priorities, right? So let's say you have $100 a month to put toward preparedness. You got to look and say, what can I do myself or do inexpensively or buy secondary market? What do I have to buy new? And you figure that out and you have it match that priority. I think when people freak out, they either go way over budget and they're like, oh my God, I'm buying stuff that I don't need now. And I'm going without now for stuff I may not need. Or they go way under budget and they don't realize what they can do. You know, again, I use the rice example. If you were to do that once a week, it would be less than $100 a month. And you would have, what, how many pounds of rice? You're probably talking 100 pounds of rice. I do it with beans.
What about people who don't have room to store a lot of stuff, right? So that becomes an issue if you want to.
And I think that has to match into your plan, right? I talked in the plan about objective priorities, all that. Constraints are a big part of it, and budget being one of them. But I think you need to, a lot. If let's say you're in a 1-bedroom condo or something like that. Yeah. One thing I've read people do is they consolidate their preparations. Maybe you get a locker, like a small storage locker with a bunch of people, and that's where your stuff is, or you do that yourself. At a minimum, you can keep a small amount of stuff, right? Like you figure what fits in your footprint and you go from there. But maybe you have a family member who's close and your disaster plan is enough to last a week where you're at and you're going to a location, that, and that brings up a good point. I'm really talking about stuff, but your plan and your budget and all of it need to also match, like, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Like, what is your plan? Where I live now, I feel pretty secure. Like this is where I would have gone to, this kind of place from where I was at. And I had a friend the other day, and he said to me, "Hey, should I make a go bag?" And I'm like, "But where would you go? Like you've got the river, you've got arable land, you've got like all this stuff here. This is where people come to. Like, don't worry about your go bag, but you should still always have a go bag just in case something happens." But back to what you were saying, have maybe a destination, right? Have a plan on how you're going to get out of where you're constrained.
And let people know if they're your destination, because I suspect that my house would be a destination for several families, but we need to know how many people are going to be coming to the inn if there's a zombie apocalypse.
Right. Well, and it's very interesting. There was one shift I saw in the preparedness community at one point, and I think people quickly came to realize you can't do it yourself. Like you could have all the guns in the world. You've got one hand here and one hand here. So if 1,000 people decide that they're going to take what you've got, you're not going to be able to survive.
Correct.
And there was a shift where people started to want to more educate their community and be approachable. And I like that approach. That's what my company was about when I had it. It was about saying, we're all in this together. Let's say that everybody is prepared and something happens. Let's say a fire zips through somewhere and 1/3 of the houses are burnt, but everybody has some stuff to prepare. You can share it.
Yep.
But this, I think people do equate preparedness to the zombie apocalypse movies and the shows where people are preying on each other and all that, where the outcome could be humankind surprises you because the time that happens is scarcity.
Yep.
Scarcity of resources turns really good people into maybe not so good people. But if you can create a preparedness plan that maybe involves your community, and once you get prepared, being someone who people can talk to help get the other person to pay it forward, then it would be a non-event or a minimal event. It becomes a blip, not a catastrophic issue. And I think if just people, and I'm going to go on a limb and say people were I'm responsible to my kids, as I said, but if people looked at their role in the community as being a net plus and not a net minus, and by preparing they're not, then they're doing a good thing and it can help the community.
Agreed. So you have to understand your risk. You have to find a crazy friend that will help you find your why. Make a plan, which I think can be as simple or as extensive as you want, right? So if you're just getting started, a simple plan is better than no plan.
Well, and I think this is the concentric circles too, right? I think it's like anything, it's near term, short term, the long term, whatever. So this is why I think, and I agree with what you're saying to the extent that expectations in the short term should match your resources and capabilities. But I think the plan should cover way more than that, because I think you run the risk of them falling off that cliff. It's kind of like when I did like P90X or whatever, right? And you got done with it, and you're like, oh, not now what, right?
Yep.
I didn't know, like, what am I going to do next? Like, that was when I was on Beachbody, I think. I was like, I'll do Shanti next because I did P90X, and I'll go back. Like, if you do that, you go right into the next thing and you maintain that fitness. Same with this readiness. You've got to have what that next iteration is to know what you want next.
Got it. So our plan and our timeline, then our budget. What's the last step?
It's to continue, right? It's and I touched on it earlier, but it's to execute that plan and do it in perpetuity. Keep going on forever. Read books, stay connected with it, because threats will change, right? And I hate to say that, as part of that continuation, look at things through the lens of pessimism. You could be an optimistic person, but look at it through the view of pessimism. Like, yep. Okay, what if this were to happen next? Like, if you read about something, like I remember reading about, there was like just a little blip, like in California, someone shot one of the things on the power, I can't think of the name right now. The power, and it like took out a power station.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, well, what is that really? Like, was it just kids out there shooting, or was it like, could it be people probing to see, hey, what happens if I do this? You got to look at it through that lens and say, okay, what if it is that kind of thing? Like, what would happen next? And I think just to keep moving forward and refining and perfecting what you do as part of that preparation is really, really essential. And I would say spread the knowledge at that point. Don't be afraid. Like, if you care about family members, hey, ask them, like, hey, if something happened, like, are you good? Like, right? Especially if, elderly family members, people who, who might have kids who have stuff like diabetes, right? Like, if you had a kid with type 1 diabetes, right? What happens then if everything goes down? What happens? They got to still have insulin.
Yep.
And part of that is all this kind of planning, right? It's all this kind of stuff. So, just continuing and paying it forward and spreading the word on all that kind of stuff.
It's funny you say that. And my first thought is I would go to the network of people that I've come to know who also have kids with type 1 diabetes. Right. But how do I reach them? Through the internet.
Right.
So if that's gone down, I don't even have that network anymore.
Oh, totally. I mean, what's interesting, and this is a little side thing, but when people think of preparedness, they think guns. When preppers think of preparedness, we usually think medical,
yep,
and communication, because the you're going to die quicker from an infection that goes bad than
yep,
likely being killed by some kind of gunfight. Like, people generally don't want to shoot at each other. So if things get bad, but if you get a cut and it gets infected, what are you going to do at that point? Like, depending on the severity, like, there might be first responders, but they may not be able to get there quickly. So do you have topical,
yep,
do you have a tourniquet?
Bandages, tourniquets.
If you had for a long time, well, then, things could get really bad. That's why, knowing about things like natural antibiotics, there's certain foraging things that you can pick up as you talk about skills, which, are cool anyhow, right? Like, foraging's cool. There's a guy who lives in my town who's like a big mushroom forager, all right? And we had like a lot of fun over the fall where he would harvest some mushrooms and we'd cook them, and I learned a lot. That was fun. I just picked up a new skill. That's a long-term skill, nothing I have to buy, but that's part of my plan, right? Anytime I got a chance to pick up a skill, I do it. And I think that's an important thing.
Side note, I don't know if you've seen these movies, but the movie's A Quiet Place, and then the second one came out.
I did. You know what? Wait, can I say what my gripe is first?
Go ahead.
How could the army can't kill these monsters, and she kills it with a 12 gauge? That I won't see the second one.
Those are the unrealistic parts, right? But the part about it that fascinated me, even from the first one, was all the strategizing and preparedness, right? So you can't make noise, so you have to steam your food. And so
Right.
to have the lights go red as opposed to an alarm, like all of that was just so interesting to me, the thought processes behind it. And I think that that's,
It's a cool, you know what? I think when you flip that switch, as long as you don't go over the cliff,
yes.
it's kind of cool because you should be like the same way when you walk into a room, you should kind of know where the exits are, not because someone's going to come in like Yosemite Sam, but if there's a fire, like where are the exits?
Yep.
You know, that's why they tell you where they are on a plane. But when you start thinking from a preparedness perspective, then any room you walk into, you're looking where the exits are. You're looking at what is the appropriate things to know for what could happen in that environment. And I guess that makes really number 5 kind of embracing, like taking that next step as from getting started to being that. And before we run out of time, the big mistake is people trying to think they have to do it all at one time. And trying to eat the shark or eat the whale, you know, in one sitting. And I think that becomes the hard part. They just shut down. And as a result, they never do it until it's right in front of their face.
Yep.
And they don't realize that, you know, an iterative process of slowly doing that means that it is, you know, the small steps that get you to where you need to be. And I think just not doing anything is the huge mistake. And you hear about it. And I was talking to Cece before this, and I was saying, you know, when you see on TV, someone gets snowed in their car and all this kind of crap happens, and miraculously they survived. I would actually say that more often than not, they created their luck. And there might have been some good luck things that happened, but usually they have stuff in their car. There were things that they were repurposing or using purposefully for what it was meant for.
Yep.
I mean, if you live somewhere cold and you drive 100 miles round trip a day, you should have some stuff in your car because you just don't know when you might be alone on a road. So it's that not getting started and then not having anything, you're creating bad luck. Where if you're working toward that, the knowledge you're picking up, and I think this is where when I say people don't do anything, and it's almost as bad just to write a big check, this is kind of like when you're in school and you take notes, and the synaptic connection where you're writing the note means you learned it, and you don't even have to look at your notes.
Yep.
Later on because you learned it. Going through all these processes and taking action allows you then to be in a mindset and learn these things as opposed to like, oh, I have like a thing, like a survival kit, but I don't know how to use anything. I don't know where anything is. You know, it's just not a smart way to do it. Like
we talked about that with the gun show. Like
totally.
going and buying a gun doesn't really do anything. You have to know how to use it and maintain it and clean it. Yeah.
Totally. Like this go bag, like I do have a go bag. I kitted it myself because I want to know what is in there, you know, what's the quality of it, where is it in there? All those kind of things are important. Otherwise you grab a backpack and you know you don't know how to use anything.
Exactly. All right, I think that wraps us up. So we're going to all go Google, you know, how to get started. Or they can contact you, right?
They can always contact me. Who knows? Maybe the Mellow Prepper will rise from the dead based on all the crappy things happening in the world. But thanks for joining us on Getting Started.Life. You know, again, I said our show's about getting started on things, and hopefully you learned something today. If there's something you want to learn about, let us know. Help us know what topics you want to see. We'll find the expert. If you're an expert in something that you think would benefit people, and I don't think anything is too pedestrian, right? I think there's a lot of things people want to learn. Reach out to us. We'll see if it makes a good show, and we'd love to have you on and help other people. We're on every other Tuesday. We're taking a break next week, and then we're on the week after that. And I think hopefully she's got to confirm with us, but I think it's how to start being better in bed, if I'm correct.
I think that you are correct.
Yeah, we got to confirm with her. That's it's going to be a good show.
Yeah.
But thanks for joining us. If you like us, please go to YouTube, find our things, share them, or subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks.